start out with our guest speakers. I think you all had a copy of the agenda emailed to you, or you picked one, a hard copy up here tonight. We're very honored to have some very prestigious people from the City of Seattle here tonight. Michael Jenkins, the Director of the Seattle Design Commission, right here.
Hi.
And Beverly Barnett from the Seattle Department of Transportation. And Barbara Gray from the ESTROT Street Use and Urban Forestry Division Director. Yeah.
Does that all fit on the car?
It does, actually. I have one
That's
chasing
it.
around here somewhere.
So as I've outlined, as we're all of our neighbors are concerned about all the growth that's going on here. In the past several years, we've had 3 projects that have gone before the Seattle Design Commission requesting a review of the street vacations. The first one was the former Connor, now Equity Project on California and Alaska. The second one was the former Hole in the Ground, which is now the Spruce LA Fitness Project here on Fauntleroy in Alaska. And then the third one is the Weingarten Whole Foods Project on Fauntleroy in Alaska. So tonight we're going to try and, well, I'd like to ask you to keep, we're going to do, they're each going to speak for about 7 minutes, and then after Beverly's going to go first and talk about the alley vacation, street vacation process, and then Michael's going to follow up with the role of the Seattle Design Commission. When Beverly's done, if you can just ask very short questions. We have only about 10 minutes per speaker, so, and then Michael will follow up with the Seattle Design Commission's role in the process as well. All right, welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think thank you for having us out. I think you were going to say a couple things before I got started.
Yeah, I was just going to kick us off. So the street vacation process is not particularly straightforward. It's a challenging set of policies and directives that is delegated to cities by the state. And Beverly works in ESTOT. Her sole job is to manage the street vacation process, which was when an entity, typically a private developer, but sometimes another agency, will come in and want to take right-of-way that's been specifically dedicated as right-of-way and convert it to private property. And there's a process that's been laid out quite specifically in a set of policies, street vacation policies, that we follow. And her job is to inform the council and the executive as we move forward to make some decisions. And so we thought it would be valuable at Renee's invite to come and talk a little bit more, because we know that there's tons of development here, and a lot of these projects here and in other areas of the city. South Lake Union is experiencing huge growth right now, and a lot of the way that those lots and blocks are platted, the way the streets and the parcels intersect, mean that there's some significant pressure to look at the developers or looking at vacating some of those alleys, and in some cases some streets as well. So Beverly's quite busy these days pondering many of these and preparing information for the deliberative process that actually lives squarely with the city council to make all sort of formal decisions about that. So I'm going to let her talk about that, and we have a little cheat sheet here.
A little handout. Thank you. Well, thanks for having us out. I've been out in West Seattle quite a bit in recent years. And usually I like to come out when Bakery Nouveau is open. So coming out this time is a little hard, but I'll have to swing by again. So I think Barbara did a good introduction. A couple of things that I want to talk about with street vacations is how a street vacation review is different from other land use actions. So if you all are here, I'm assuming that you follow development activity, I know Deb does, and look at kind of what's happening, and you're probably fairly familiar with kind of their regulatory scheme of development. And when you hear about new projects, you wonder about the zoning and the transportation and how it's going to fit in with the adopted plans. Well, street vacations are really unique, and as Barbara referenced, they're unique because of the property that's involved. And when you're talking about public right-of-way, we're not talking about the same kind of real estate. It's not a parcel that the city owns or ESTOT owns that we can buy or sell. So when streets are created, they're generally created through the plat process, or we can also acquire them through condemnation. But if you imagine, you know, a big block in West Seattle, if you own a big parcel of property, you're going to plat it and subdivide it into lots and blocks, and those lots and blocks are going to create the street grid to serve the parcels, and that's how real estate gets sectioned off for development. But because it was never platted as an individual separate lot, it's really considered that it's dedicated for public use in perpetuity. So street right-of-way is really defined by its creation, not by its use. So even though, you know, with your topography out in West Seattle, you might have a street that goes into a ravine or into the lake or up and down, and if it was platted as street right-of-way, we still consider it a public asset for those purposes forever. And as Barbara said, the state legislature has given the exclusive authority to legislative bodies to make the final decisions about street vacations. And so the city council looks at it from the perspective of a trustee of the public. So if we're giving up a public asset, what are the circumstances where that's appropriate? And so we don't look at the land use code, we look at the adopted policies, and the city council has really clarified the steps that we go through in the procedure and the circumstances when it's appropriate to vacate. And so we're really looking at it as a policy document. And street vacation decisions are discretionary. So no one has the right to acquire or use public right-of-way for private development purposes. And so my job, I'm always supposed to look at it and say, what does the public get out of this? So I'm supposed to be the person who says, if you're getting our great alley for your project, what do we get out of it? And that's kind of that notion guides the whole vacation review process, that what the public is giving up and what does the public achieve. So the street vacation policies really outline 3 areas that we're supposed to look at. And so the first thing we look at is what the policies define as the public trust purposes. And this is your classic street purposes. So what do streets do? They serve us for circulation and access. They're a corridor for utilities, and they also have under their defined purposes for light, air, and open space. And this isn't open space like usable parkland, but it's sort of that breathing space between developments. So when you go out, you can look up and down a street, and it's a great way that we, you know, keep enough space that we can all move around the city. So it's really an important element of just that general open space, not, you know, our park and recreation. So that's the most important thing. The streets, what they're supposed to do, that fundamental purpose. The second thing we look at is land use impacts, and there where we would get into looking at some of these kinds of documents. If somebody wants to get rid of an alley or a street for private development, is it then going to be something that's out of scale and character, or does the zoning specify that, yeah, all the new development is going to be whatever it is, 65 or 85 feet. So we can look at that a little bit and see, does it fit in with the planning and the city's goals and the neighborhood goals. And the third thing we look at is public benefit. And this is always kind of the difficult one, and this is the one where we get a lot of questions because it's not really that precise. And what the policies talk about is, again, that notion of a balancing test. So we look at what does the vacation contribute to the development project. So we try to see how impactful is the project, how much does the vacation contribute to, you know, the developer's ability to do that particular project. Can we mitigate the impacts of the project? And sort of the more we stack on one side, the more then we look at and say, we really want a really great public benefit, or it's got to be bigger than what we're seeing. If it's a smaller project, partial vacation, maybe it's a partial vacation and they're rededicating an alley, then those kind of balance it. They're getting less out of the vacation process, so the public doesn't need as rigorous of a public benefit. We still want something good, but, you know, we're going to balance that. So those are the 3 things we look at. So with street vacations, you have to be an abutting property owner to petition, and that's because of what we talked about before, that, you know, it's like your lot gave up a portion to create the street. So only abutting property owners can petition. They're only entitled to acquire what abuts their lot. So where we see partial alley vacations, as with Wine Garden Whole Food, they can't acquire the whole alley because they don't own the whole block. So we get a petition in SDOT. We circulate it pretty broadly for review, so you see a lot of executive departments weighing in. In DPD, it goes to both the land use planners and you know, and we look at planning compliance and land use code compliance, goes to Michael and the Design Commission, and that's one of the most significant elements of the review that Michael will talk about. It goes to all of the utilities, so we find out if there's drainage impacts or if city light needs to be relocated, and we get input from a wide variety of people within and outside the city. And it goes to Design Commission, and then in SDOT's side, I kind of stitch together everything we hear and try to formulate a recommendation based on what I've heard of all these other executive experts, what we hear from the Design Commission, what we hear from the community, and then within SDOT, our director will craft a recommendation that we forward to the City Council where it's heard at the Transportation Committee. The City Council is required to hold a public hearing, and then they'll hear from the community, supporters, questions, opposition. They'll hear from me and they'll hear from the developer, and then they'll make their decision. So I think that kind of covers my time. So the next step would be Michael, or are we doing questions now?
How about questions?
Okay.
Would that be okay? All right. Would anyone like to ask Beverly a question about the alley vacation street process?
We can share.
No one?
Wow. No, that was excellent.
Really?
What kind of things do you consider as the public benefit?
Oh, that's a really good question. The policies really want to have a very specific kind of public benefit, and I can tell you what we've looked at historically. And historically, we've looked at tangible elements around a project. So what you see on past vacations, we see plazas, artwork, widened sidewalks. We've had projects that have made contributions to city parks, artwork, really enhancements into the public realm, and those have been mainly what we've seen on traditional projects have been those kinds of elements.
It's interesting, if you read the street vacation policies, and there's a pretty specific set of policies that frame up all three of those components, including what's in the public benefit package, it actually talks much more broadly about the public's interest and value in that project. That's frames up the discussion about public benefit. And in that discussion, it talks about, does the project sort of forward a broader set of citywide goals? And it references things like affordable housing and family wage jobs and economic incentives, and it talks much more broadly about that. The public benefit itself, the actual tangible public benefit that usually comes out of a vacation, has a transportation nexus, but the policies frame up the discussion much more broadly, and I think you all have heard a fair bit about how those policies can kind of frame up some of these discussions, so that's kind of an interesting wrinkle of late.
Mm-hmm.
So it's normally turned into amenity, is that oversimplifying it?
No, because I think that is the idea that, you know, that if a developer is mitigating project impacts and doing things that are required in the land use code, those really aren't public benefits. So we look at public benefits as being an additive to that. So just doing a really nice sidewalk wouldn't count, but maybe if the sidewalk is 17 feet instead of 8 feet, and we see a double row of trees, or they're doing, you know, a bunch of oak benches or something that aren't required by code, then we start to see things that we consider as public benefit, because those would be amenities that the public would not get unless there was a vacation associated with the project.
So it's not like you could trade off maybe getting more from the zoning code, or put it a different way, maybe a little more setback, you're giving up light and air in some way, so could you ask for the change to the massing?
Well,
in
I
terms of
think-
shaping, and maybe not.
Two very different things.
Yeah.
And what the Design Commission, it's a nice segue,
Oh,
if you don't mind.
Oh, I have a question,
Okay.
but I'll let you go first, Michael.
No, I was just gonna hit on that topic,
please do.
which is, you know, the loss of the Design Commission is particularly concerned about the loss of the open space and transportation network. That's really where we operate. And with the loss of that, how is the remaining portion of that network better to mitigate the project impact? And so that's really what the Design Commission is looking at, to make sure in our recommendation to SDOT that there's a robust discussion about that. And like what Barbara had said, there is a lot of discretion, because frankly you want to have a lot of broad look, because And I spent, before being the director of the Design Commission, I spent 7 years at the City Council helping the council on issues with vacations. You want that level of discretion because each one stands on its own. Each project stands on its own. Each project has its own set of problems, and each project necessarily has to have its own set of solutions. The Design Commission is concerned about the public realm. The design review process really looks at the building and the site improvements. And those are two very important distinctions.
Oh, yeah, that is good. Okay. I have a question for Beverly on timing. It seems like the design review process for the building, the site's going on simultaneously to the, or concurrent with the design review process. And there's doesn't seem to be a lot of communication between the two, back and forth on.
Well, generally with most projects, we might see multiple review procedures going on at the same time because, well, frankly, people don't want to spend 5 years in the review process doing things in a serial fashion. So we do really try to coordinate, and Michael will probably speak to this a little bit too, between the Design Commission and the Design Review Board. But there are projects that have rezones, they might have landmarks board review or be within a special review district. So there's SEPA and transportation analysis. So there can be a lot of things going on in a big project. And generally, the one step that would happen first would be the early design guidance. You know what, I think you guys know it as the EDG, and that's the one procedure that the city has said, okay, developer, you go out to the neighborhood first, you take your alternatives there, then when you have a project, you come in and you can go through, you know, the MUP and Design Commission and Design Review and your rezone and everything all at the same time. And it is a big part of our jobs to try to keep those chess pieces going in the right order, but people do go through everything consistently. So because the street vacation is a legislative decision, that decision does have to be made before a master use permit can issue. So there are some kind of ultimate boundaries. And we would see normally if there was a rezone or another a quasi-judicial land use action. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that term, but there are certain land use actions where the city council has to base their decision on the record. And so for those kinds of decisions that go to the hearing examiner and go to the city council makes those first, because with the street vacation decision, it's not based on a record, they can hear anything. So we do the record-based land use decision first, and then the wilder vacation process would come later. So depending on what the project is, we sit down with people and try to kind of figure out a schedule, but they do go through a lot of things at the same time just so they can do something at some point more quickly.
Thank you.
I have a question. I know you judge each project on its own merit, but collectively that has an impact on the area. Who is responsible for stepping back the 20,000-foot view and saying we have these things happening here? And also, who is projecting the future? Now, no one can see the future, but at least thinking about how is this going to impact the neighborhood or the community in 5 years, 10 years, or in, say, 2, 3, when a lot of these buildings in our area come online. And there's going to be an influx. Has the city prepared for that, i.e. transportation? And are we losing anything? Even though each project has met your criteria, collectively, it may present another problem.
Yeah, I'd say that, I work in the planning department, and Beverly works in SDOT. And in the planning department, works with the city council to establish those policies. What is the policy of the city as to growth, and how is that implemented? It's implemented through the zoning code and through the land use map, which sets heights and development standards. And I think that's that first, the council has that responsibility. They have not delegated that entirely to the planning department, but rather they rely upon the planning department to help provide that analysis based upon their policy goals and desires, which are brought in the comp plan. So that they're establishing that here, and as it comes down here, it plays out at individual projects. I would argue that as part of what the council is doing when they adopt those policies, they are trying to figure out or determine what is the vision as part of a neighborhood planning process, as part of an outreach to a community? What do we want this neighborhood to be and look like, and how does it function? On an individual level, that's captured quite differently than on a collective level. And I think that sort of blue sky look later on, you're talking about what's going to happen in 20 years, and we sure hope that the code captures that. You hear later on that, well, gee, maybe we needed to do this, let's look at fixing this. That's that blue sky that I think happens, and necessarily needs to happen 5, 8, 10 years down the road.
I think one of the things that's also a tool we're using a lot more frequently, and I think to your point, the West Seattle Triangle Plan is a good example of taking sort of that high-level policy direction and putting some structure and more specific design around it. I think that it provides a level of detail that requires a lot of actors to implement. So it either requires capital investment from the city to implement, it requires a more coordinated look at all these different projects to ensure that it's being addressed. But I also think there are outcomes that we can't plan for. So, for example, the debate that we're having right now about transit funding, right? So maybe some of these solutions work best when you have a higher level of transit service, and if that's something that you have to try to collectively plan for, work together on that, then you can have a better outcome. But it's kind of challenging to get that just right.
In a company, you think of the downside as well as the positive.
Mm-hmm.
And so, going to your point about a downside, for example, Metro doesn't have the budget to add more transportation. That's causing problems already. So, does that kind of discussion ever enter? Like, this is great, looks all terrific, all things are system to go, but what happens if this? We have a bridge that, if any of you have gone across it between the hours of 7. I'm sorry. I'm digressing.
That's an important
No.
issue,
It's
but
very
it might
important.
be.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, just in the sake of
Right.
time in the meeting agenda.
I do think that the SEPA analysis does help
Yeah.
to look at those
Oh, good.
downsides and mitigate those impacts, because it
Thank
looks
you.
at transportation analysis.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll be quiet.
And the other comment I would add to your, who's looking at it from the 20,000 foot is, and I was part of the neighborhood planning process down in Morgan Junction, is definitely pull out your neighborhood plan.
Right.
Because I think the triangle plan usurped some of the original work that was done in that first neighborhood plan, which is where capacity studies were supposed to have been done. So if you guys are shooting past your targets, you ought to be tracking that and talking to council saying, we're at 100, I gotta believe you're at 120% capacity from your neighborhood targets, and use that as a discussion point for, the market's gonna do what the market's gonna do.
Right.
But for them to come in and, think that without knowing anything else, that they should add 2 more stories to every building because that's a great idea, you have to be able to talk about the consequences of that. But you have to use your neighborhood plan, which is adopted by law, as a base point.
That's right, we have neighborhood plans.
So I'll go ahead and dive off into Design Commission if just to.
One last question, sir.
Well,
Thank you.
yeah, just Beverly, by the time a street vacation proposal gets to a public city council hearing, there's usually, pretty bolted on architecture of an agreement. And the council, I haven't found very many cases where the council said no or changed it up very much at that point. And yet that is the only point at which the public really gets to weigh in a formal way. There's sometimes 20 minutes in the Design Commission hearings, but often the developers filibuster and you get less. And usually the Design Commission is kind of ready to go with its opinion by the time, even by that point. So I'm wondering, is there any thinking in SDOT or in your office or in your chair about ways to bring the public in earlier? There's a lot of public comment in the design review process, but the design review commissions have little power to actually affect the project. On the other hand, the Design Commission and SDOT in a street vacation have a lot of power to affect the project, but there's little public input. And so I'm wondering how to square that circle.
Well, I would not agree that there's little public input, because having done this for a long time, when we get a new petition in, we do invite comment, and those comments are In the same way that you do with every other kind of land use action, you do written comments to the department that's reviewing it. We get lots and lots of comments on projects, and those are considered. They're part of the record that the council reviews, and we respond to them. So you are correct that the public hearing comes at the end, and that certainly has been something that's been flagged, because what the council wants is for SDOT and all of the executive departments to figure out all of the issues and then be able to go to the council and say either this drainage cannot be fixed, or say we flag drainage as an issue and here's what's going to resolve it. So they do want us to get issues out and come forward with a solution if we find one. But we find with many projects we have a very engaged community and lots of comments that we require the developer to address and we speak to the council on. But you're right, the public hearing, that's a conundrum we haven't solved, that the public hearing kind of comes at that last piece.
Thank you, Beverly. I just have one last quick little question. The letter from the mayor regarding the Whole Foods project, where is the status of that now, and what is the next step? Just if you can, just in a nutshell, tell us.
So the council is gonna, they go into their budget deliberations coming up here in the next couple of weeks' time. So they're, the end of December would be the next time that they would be prepared to talk about other issues other than budget.
Okay.
And so we will be providing to them at some point between now and then, probably closer to then than now. And I don't even know if they'll make the decision as to when they're gonna deliberate the technical analysis that Beverly was describing.
And then to your point, Beverly, about advocating for neighborhoods, that you still are accepting public comment on this project up
All the way
until that
through.
time?
All
Okay,
the way
okay,
through.
good to know.
Yeah, we don't close comments, so with a normal, when you see a MUP board posted, the DPD will close comment and the record will be closed. With the vacation, we'll take comments up until the point that we're forwarding it to City Council.
Right. And I would just underscore that although this is kind of a formal statement by the mayor's office, we have, the mayor and the departments talk and deliberate on issues with great frequency, whether it's about vacation proposals or it's about community workforce development agreements related to the seawall or any number of things that may or may not happen during the formal process, but they do actually have that ability to kind of weigh in and deliberate on kind of any policy directive. So although this one's framed up kind of uniquely, there's certainly plenty of mayoral input pretty much on every street vacation that we move forward.
Very good. Thank you. Michael, thank you.
You're welcome. So the Seattle Design Commission is, which I'm the director of, is made up of 10 professionals in architecture, landscape architecture, design, planning, development. Page 8 of this book. Did everyone get it? Pass out to everyone. Is fairly clear. This is the broad brush of what the Design Commission does for the city. Page 8 sets forth what we do as part of a street and alley vacation process. And our recommendations, like Beverly had said, goes, once we've completed our work, goes to her along with all the other departments that provide her with comment. So when the Design Commission looks at a street or alley vacation, it's pretty, based upon what you see on page 8, pretty straightforward. The commission reviews vacations in 2 steps. The first question before them is the urban design merit. And that's, I'm going to boil that down wildly to a pretty straightforward statement, which is when you lose that alley and you create a much larger block or a much different block, how does it impact the neighborhood around it, and what does that do to the transportation functions going to that newly configured block? It's fairly straightforward. So once that question is asked and answered, the next question is, what are the public benefits that are attributable to the loss of the open space and transportation network by the loss of that alley, portion of the alley, or in rare cases, that street? And that's the work that we do for Beverly and for the city to help look at those 2 issues. The urban design merit typically happens within 1 or 2 meetings. The public benefit question can take 2, 3, 4 meetings, depending upon the complexity of the project and the quality of the public benefits. that are developed as part of the development's request to seek approval from the Design Commission. So what I did was to hand out, this was our recommendation on the Fauntleroy project. And it's fairly straightforward. The commission actually, ultimately, after several meetings, did develop a recommendation to support the public benefit package that consisted of 8 very specific deliverables, for lack of a better word. Setbacks, the mid-block connector, implementing in part of the West Seattle Triangle Plan, plazas, Green Street improvements, a contribution towards the design of a park on the north side of 40th Avenue Southwest, which I think was also in the West Seattle Triangle Plan. So the Design Commission will look at an adopted plan, because we prefer to look at an adopted plan as opposed to any another sort of aspirational plan that may or may not have been approved legislatively. We want to have that sort of stamp of approval, because otherwise it may not have the same level of agreement. That the community, varying voices in the community, we don't want to necessarily do that. Rather, we want to have something that's been recognized by the city as the formal statement for that neighborhood or area. It's a pretty straightforward. The Design Commission does a whole lot of other things, and in this book you'll see much of what we do. The bulk of what we do actually are CIP projects, capital improvement projects, libraries, community centers. As Beverly would tell you, we probably only look at 6, 8 of these a year. There aren't many. And so that's part of the challenge is, because they don't happen that often, and then they happen, each one is quite different. You'll probably remember seeing a lot of press about Amazon's new corporate headquarters downtown. Required 3 alley vacations, very different, very, very different. So each one is a look at what happens on that block to the loss of that street or alley, and what happens to the transportation network, and how can the public benefit package mitigate the loss of that network. And that's why the Design Commission is appointed by people in the profession, architects, landscape architects. We have a transportation engineer, because one of the things that we're looking at is, it's called the WAVN, it's the West Approach to 520. We're also looking at the seawall, we're looking at the viaduct, the loss of the viaduct and the new tunnel. So that's why we have that broad brush of design and architecture professionals to help develop that advice based upon the scope of the project.
Great, questions? I've attended a few Design Commission meetings, and I appreciate the time and energy that the commissioners spend when I see that their agenda goes from, through lunch and all this. So I do appreciate that. I have a couple questions.
Sure.
Do you know the publication date of this particular document?
Well, the minutes, it was from the June 20th meeting, and
No, I'm looking for the exact.
Right. I don't know. I think, we try to get them out in about 2 weeks after the meeting. I'd have to find out when those were posted and made available to the public.
And that gets into a concern that I'd like to express, in that relationship between the Design Review Board and a little bit about what you talked about, Beverly, how things are moving at the same time. So that relationship between a decision or a recommendation, let's say, by either one of the groups, whether it's Design Commission or a Design Review Board, and the methodology where those recommendations are communicated across the hall, or to board, if you will. I would like to observe that the recommendations from the Commission at the 4755 project, when it went to its last, or most recent Design Review Board meeting, there was nothing in writing from the Design Commission present at that meeting or had gone to staff. And it was I felt very uncomfortable that it was the applicant who spoke on behalf of what the Design Commission said to do. And from
a public perspective, that didn't feel right. When I know that there's been so much effort to keep meetings open and to keep the information flowing. So I'm wondering, how is that standard? I realized that the Design Commission had some staffing challenges and there was bringing people up to speed about minutes and all that good stuff, but it felt really sloppy to have the applicant speak for the Design Commission at a Design Review Board meeting.
Well, remember, and I'll leave some of these for you to help explain. Remember, the Design Commission is concerned with the public realm, where the Design Review Board is concerned about the on-site development. And I say that because it's an important distinction. The Design Commission has no authority to dictate what's going on. That's the Design Review Board's requirement. So for the Design Commission, they may be interested in the basic form and looking at the design, overall urban design merit, but they're looking at it in a much different way than the Design Review Board is, simply because the Design Commission does not have the authority under the code to extend itself onto the site. That's what the Design Review Board is for.
But if
So
they're
having said that,
talking about the same areas.
but again, it's the public realm versus on-site development. Would the Design Review Board benefit from the Design Commission's perspective? I believe that there, in fact, Beverly and I met this week just on that very issue. We're looking at, because the issue of urban design merit mirrors early design guidance in some ways. We're looking at trying to figure out, how do we take the early design guidance materials and involve the Design Commission early on, because they're looking at some of the same issues in that form. But it retreats very quickly after that when you're talking about public benefits within the right-of-way. The Design Review Board does not have authority over the right-of-way improvements. The Design Commission does not advise on on-site development. But that doesn't mean that the two are always mutually exclusive. And so what we're looking at is, well, how can we take that relationship early on and improve upon that? And we're looking at that right now. I'm looking at Beverly because we were in a meeting yesterday to look at how can that happen in a way that both boards and commission are better informed.
I think it would be something really good to resolve. Case in point would have been the matrix, Beverly, that I know you asked the 4755 folks to work on and fine tune, and oh gosh, that really isn't appropriate for this matrix of public benefit, things like that. That document, obviously something from the design, that the Design Commission needed to make the recommendation, was asked for by the Design Review Board so that they knew what areas they weren't to get into, but it didn't exist, and the applicant was representing it and had, an older version of it. So it was very awkward and didn't feel good to have a project of this stature get into that murkiness, at least from my opinion. So I'm glad to hear that that's getting worked on. One other question that I had then with the meetings, and I know that you guys love to get those last minute plan changes as they're presented that morning, and you may have heard about them and suddenly there's a new layout or something new. What's your typical procedure for notifying the public and allowing the public to be able to comment on something that's changed from a previous meeting?
Well, what I'm looking at, I took over being the director 6 weeks ago, so I'm just starting to...
Congratulations.
Well, thank you. But I'm starting to, you can imagine what I'm trying to look at right now.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm looking at, and I'm going to call process improvement. Right now, I've been bothered by the fact that projects will have in the past, there's been that sort of very quick turnaround. I've been bothered by it more specifically because I don't think it allows the Design Commission to do meaningful work in advance. So what I'm looking at right now is kind of shifting around the process where looking at and working with the Design Commission to say, what does an application look like? What is an application to the Design Commission? What is a credible packet for them to commence their work? how much time needs to occur between that and sitting down with the development team and saying, we called it when I worked at council called issue ID. What are the significant issues that we believe that the commission will be looking at and be interested in? And we need to have you start thinking about that as you develop your project, both from the urban design merit and the public benefit issue. And then take that direction and have the team develop that direction, come back several weeks before the scheduled meeting so that package can be reviewed by staff, refined, posted within a week at least, so the public can take notice of it. But more importantly, my design commission members will be informed and ready to go. So the meetings I hope, have a much more rigorous tone to them. And so, but I have a whole lot of bias. I have to get to that first. But conceptually, the design commission in my early talks with them have been, they identified it in their own retreat as being something of importance. And so I'm trying to figure out how to implement that direction. We haven't gotten buy-off on that yet, but that's the approach I want to take with them. The other important party in this is our stakeholders. When the commission have looked at, is that the desirable process to get to a meeting? I want to make sure that we document that and then go out to the development community and go out to stakeholders and say, are there any red flags? It doesn't make any sense for us to develop an idea or a process if the people on the other side are going to go, wait a minute, that's not workable. That doesn't help. So I want to make sure that we get something that works for the design commission. We go out to the community, stakeholders, developers, residents, everyone to say, does this make sense? Are we missing anything? And then start to implement that on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But you can't quote me on that. I'm trying to work that out now.
More questions for Michael?
I have just a technical question. At the end of the public benefit review for 4755 Fauntleroy, a number of the recommendations were called for further administrative review, and a lot of us were scratching our heads. What's that mean? Who's doing the reviewing? Who's deciding if it falls short after the administrative review? What happens if it falls short? You know.
Well, the person who would be doing that administrative review is staff. I might be doing it depending upon the nature of the project. More likely than not, it would be Valerie Keenast, who's the board coordinator. When the commission has decided to provide staff with that authority to go ahead and deal with some of the smaller scale issues that resolving smaller problems, not larger scale problems. Typically a design commission member, at least one, have been appointed to be the lead on the project, specifically the person who does the action that's referred to. We would sit down with them and say, do you think that the solution that they brought forward since then captures the intent of the commission? Did they dot that I? Not writing it out, not looking at the sentence, the entire sentence. Did they take that one element and provide the clarity that the commission had decided was appropriate to allow admin staff to complete that? We wouldn't want them to take a large-scale issue that had some level of conflict, some unresolved issue. Rather, was that, one example might be the southwest, the case of Fauntleroy, the southwest corner, that plaza treatment. If there was a unresolved issue with seat placement or maybe the type of material, I would argue that's an appropriate thing for staff to resolve with the developer. Did you consider this material, maybe use this material, as opposed to does there even need to be a plaza at that corner? That's a commission issue. But the actual detail, I would argue, is appropriate for staff to nail out those fine points.
I have one question. Well, first I want to just thank both Beverly and the Design Commission and Valerie, who's not here tonight, because as a neighborhood advocate, commenting on these alley vacations that we've had in the last several years, I always get a confirmation letter an email back noting that it's become part of public record. And I want to encourage everyone here to do the same. They're very communicative, and everything is documented.
If you are on a mailing list, you'll get that.
Get the records, yeah. But to Steve's point, and I know you're looking at process right now, I think it's a very good one. It's not as transparent when the Design Commission reviews are happening, and it would help all of the neighborhood advocates to know the particular points that are deliberated on, so that when we follow up at the design review meetings, we know, what has been spoken to and where the focus is, because we know they're going to respond to what the Design Commission says. So that way we can kind of tailor our guidance and within a realistic way to drive the community concerns.
And one of the things that I'm looking at too, and I feel like you guys have been looking at my calendar all this week. I've met with the people that deal with publication of master use permit decisions to say, I want to find a space and I want a better understanding of when the commission is given recommendations, how's the planner who's writing that decision? How is that 360? What have they looked at to make sure that the plans reflect the commission's direction, not only at the master use permit stage, but the building permit stage? And what do we do is that, I don't know that it's appropriate to have the plans routed to us. Rather, I want to make sure that that communication happens. Right now it happens, but I think in a more of an ad hoc way, and I want to look at formalizing that a little bit. We were a commission in 2010 that lost its director and went essentially from 3.5 staff to 1.5 staff. And Valerie did a yeoman's job of keeping that ship afloat during some really tough economic times. Now that the budget was allowed to hire not only myself, but to expand staff a bit, those are the kind of issues that frankly didn't have the time or staff to devote to improving. And that's one of the things that I'm going to be doing.
I had a rather amusing experience at the last meeting. I went online to look at some stuff that had been talked about. And I got onto a written review, I think, from a design review board meeting or something. And I'm reading through the thing and I come across a word out of left field somewhere. Gallimaufry?
Oh, Gallimaufry?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I
Where
looked
did you
it up.
find that bird? I saw that. Okay, what is it?
Yeah.
That was in a report.
They could just have easily written a word that a lot of us use, a hodgepodge.
Okay. It was a criticism.
Or a
yeah.
mixture.
It's used as a
And
descriptive term.
I'm wondering if the guy
Yes.
that used that word did it so that
Maybe
you'd find out if anybody ever read it.
Maybe he bought he or she bought a new thesaurus and
There we
something
go.
in the world.
That's it.
You know?
But somebody
I
in the
took
city
that
had
word
used
to
it.
our staff meeting as the word of the day.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody knew it. They all thought it was an architecture term. So Ryan knows it now.
Wow.
So just, and very briefly, what I've left for you too, just to give you a broader look at what the Design Commission does, our annual report that shows all of the projects that we've worked on.
Okay.
And then I think this is very helpful to answer some of the questions. This is called Project Design Review in Seattle, and it not only looks at Design Review Board, but Design Commission, Planning Commission, the various historic district boards, and the landmark preservation boards. These are all the different reviews that get to the issue of design and design quality and aesthetics in the city. And I think it'd be helpful for you, and it does sort of underscore the complexity that is applied on developments and the level of scrutiny and public notice and public scrutiny that are offered to projects. I think it's helpful
And
context.
that is really good, but that still doesn't address like the level of environmental review and traffic
Right.
analysis. It doesn't say if there's, how we handle it, if there's a rezone or a council conditional use, or your question about setbacks. It doesn't also get at all the bonus provisions that we have in the land use code for achieving additional density, or things like design departures that, you're looking at now on the DRBs. So it's kind of a small window.
And I've also left my card.
Well, thank you. Thank you
Thanks for
so
inviting
much.
us.
Yes, we appreciate it.
And if you want to I'm more than happy to come back, and if you want a more detailed talk about what the Design Commission does an awful lot, and I'd be happy to talk to you about some of the CIP projects we work on, some of the other projects.
Okay.
And if any of you, you've got my phone or my email, and we're happy to, give you whatever link to the website, engage on any issue that you want to talk about, just give me a call.